You know that feeling. You're trying to follow everything that's happening globally, and it just feels like, well, like you're drowning in news updates.
Information overload, definitely.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
you want to grasp the bigger picture, the real shifts, but without getting totally lost.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's precisely what we're aiming to unpack today. We're looking at these huge global realignments, particularly that whole dynamic between the West, the U.S. and the East, mainly China.
It's a tense relationship, to say the
Hmm.
least. And to help us navigate it, we're leaning on some recent insights from Willem Middelkoop. He's an investor, an
You have a
author.
lot of experience.
Right. And he brings this broad macroeconomic, financial, and geopolitical view, which is, well, pretty invaluable right now.
Absolutely. So our mission today really is to sift through all that complexity and pull out the core ideas from his analysis. We want to understand these power shifts, the potential for conflict, and what it all means for the future of the global financial system.
Basically, giving you those aha moments.
That's the goal. Clarity. Okay, so let's dive in. Middlecoop kicks off with quite a bold claim, doesn't he? He argues the West is past its prime, entering a downward phase, he calls it.
That's his core thesis, yes. And he contrasts that directly with the East, including the Middle East, which he sees as being in an upward phase.
Upward phase.
Yeah, he uses this analogy like 20-year life cycles, you know, young adult, mature, and then decline. He places the West somewhere in that mature to decline stage, whereas large parts of the East are still in those earlier upward stages.
Okay, but beyond just that life cycle idea, what sort of things, concrete indicators does he point to for this Western downward phase?
Yeah.
What does that actually mean for someone listening?
Well, he looks at a few areas. Economically, there are questions about long-term growth, right? High debt levels in many Western countries.
Hmm.
Maybe the consumer-driven model is running out of steam a bit.
Mm-hmm.
Socially, you've got demographics, aging populations, and, well, let's face it, growing internal divisions in some places. Put it all together, and it suggests maybe slower progress, less global influence than before.
And then he connects these sort of medium-term cycles to much bigger historical waves.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. He brings up the 81-year cycle that followed Bretton Woods, the agreement that set up the whole post-World War II financial system.
Right.
His point is that we're now in a period where these longer cycles are also signaling major changes are coming, monetary changes, geopolitical shifts.
Big ones.
Big ones. And if you zoom out even further, it kind of echoes this idea of swinging back towards how things were before, say, the 1600s, when Asia was really the center of global economic power.
That pre-1600s idea is fascinating. What specific areas like industries or tech might fuel that kind of shift back towards Asia? And how does knowing that history help us understand what countries are doing now?
Well, historically, think China, India, there were powerhouses in manufacturing, trade, even innovation for their time.
Right.
Looking ahead, you see Asia, particularly China, regaining that manufacturing edge, but also pushing hard on new frontiers, AI, renewables, digital tech. It's this combination of manufacturing muscle and future tech.
Okay.
Plus, you have things like the Belt and Road Initiative, these big strategic plays. It all points towards a world that's less U.S.-centric, more multipolar, with Asia having a much bigger economic say. It changes trade routes, financial flows, alliances, everything, really.
Okay, so you have these massive power shifts,
Yeah.
and naturally that tends to breed tension. Middle Coop really highlights how China's portrayed now in Western media much more negatively.
Even uses the term ramcours regarding the U.S. approach. What's he getting at there?
Ramkus, it basically means a collision course.
Collision course.
Yeah, he's suggesting the U.S. rhetoric and actions are setting it on a direct, maybe unavoidable path towards military confrontation with China. It's a strong warning.
And it's not just talk, right? He flags NATO getting involved, European warships patrolling the South China Sea.
That's a significant development. And beyond the military angle, he talks about a financial economic war the U.S. is supposedly waging against China. What does that entail?
Well, think trade restrictions, tariffs, banning tech transfers.
Right, the chip wars and things like that.
Exactly. Trying to limit China's access to key financial markets and advanced technology. The goal, from the U.S. view, is obviously to slow China down. But Middlecoop questions if that's actually the best long-term strategy.
What really jumps out at you about this picture of rising tensions? Is there another side to this argument that the U.S. might be isolating itself?
Well, what's really interesting is his perspective that this very confrontational U.S. approach might backfire. It could end up alienating not just China, but maybe even traditional allies who aren't comfortable with that level of conflict.
Hmm.
He points to, say, China, Japan, and South Korea working together on some financial policy responses to the U.S. That suggests some pushback. And you also see Europe keeping dialogue open with China, maybe wanting to be a bit less dependent on the U.S., especially economically. Now, the counterargument, of course, is that the U.S. feels it has to take a firm stand to protect its interests and values, even if it causes friction now.
Sure.
The real question is whether confrontation is the most effective path, or if it risks, more global instability, splitting the world economy, unintended consequences.
Let's shift focus to China itself. That story of unstoppable double-digit growth, that seems to be over. Middle Coop talks about clear signs of slowdown, maybe even contraction.
Definitely.
We hear about things like the government stopping publication of certain economic data, youth unemployment being worryingly high, and of course the whole property sector mess with Evergrande and others.
Absolutely. Those are all symptoms of a major economic shift happening within China. That old model, hyper-growth based on exports and just building stuff, seems to be hitting some serious walls.
Global competition, maybe. Debt.
All of the above. Plus, geopolitical tensions aren't helping them either.
So how does China's system, being so state-controlled, affect how they handle these problems compared to, say, the U.S. market economy?
That's a really key difference.
Yeah.
Because the state has so much control, the government can pull a lot of levers. They can tell banks to lend, prop up industries, push through policies much faster, arguably, than in the West.
More direct control.
Right, which might help them manage the fallout, contain crises to some extent. But the downside is, well, less transparency. Hidden risks can build up. The U.S. system is more dynamic, maybe more innovative, but also more prone to market swings and sometimes political paralysis when a crisis hits.
And another trend, China pushing its own currency, the yuan, for international trade, especially with the BRICS countries. Is that a serious challenge to the U.S. dollar's dominance yet?
It's significant, but maybe not an immediate knockout blow to the dollar. The dollar is still king for global trade and reserves, overwhelmingly so.
Yeah.
But yeah, every time China or Russia or Brazil does a deal in yuan or their own currencies, it chips away at that dollar dominance. It's a slow burn, a gradual shift towards a world where maybe multiple currencies play bigger roles. Definitely a trend to watch.
Which brings us right to how America is responding. Middle Coop says the U.S. is actively trying to rejig the whole global trade setup and reform its own financial system, specifically to counter China. What could happen if they push hard on this? Good and bad, for us listening.
Well, these are huge moves with potentially massive ripple effects, trying to reshape trade with tariffs, new alliances that can easily lead to trade wars.
Which means higher prices for us.
Exactly. Higher prices, disrupted supply chains. And messing with the financial system to target China, that could create more instability, maybe even, in a worst-case scenario, trigger a wider economic crisis if it's not handled very, very carefully.
So uncertainty for individuals.
Definitely. More economic uncertainty, maybe volatility in investments, changes in the job market as these global patterns shift. It touches everyone eventually.
And digging into specific strategies, Middle Coop gets into digital currencies. This feels really key for understanding what's next in finance. He talks about the U.S. government, big players like BlackRock, getting seriously interested in Bitcoin and stablecoins. Remind us quickly, what are stablecoins again?
Sure. So stablecoins are basically cryptocurrencies designed to hold a steady value. They're usually pegged one-to-one to something like the US dollar or maybe other assets like gold.
Yeah.
The idea is to get the benefits of crypto, like fast, cheap transactions, but without the wild price swings you see with Bitcoin. Stability, hence the name.
It is amazing how the view on crypto has shifted, isn't it? From the Wild West perception
Totally.
to now having huge financial institutions, even governments, looking at it seriously.
Yeah.
Middle Coop points out countries like Norway and Switzerland kind of indirectly investing in Bitcoin via companies like MicroStrategy. What's the thinking there?
Well, Bitcoin's limited supply and its global nature makes some see it as potentially a hedge against inflation, maybe currency devaluation down the road.
Like digital gold.
Sort of, yeah. So by investing in a company like MicroStrategy, which holds a ton of Bitcoin on its books, these sovereign wealth funds get exposure to Bitcoin's price movements without actually having to buy and hold the Bitcoin themselves. It's an indirect route.
And it's also telling that central bankers are now openly talking about things like Bitcoin, these private money initiatives. They seem worried, but they're acknowledging them. It does make you think about history before central banks dominated everything.
It really does. For a long time, various forms of private money existed and circulated. This comeback of private digital currencies like Bitcoin could be seen as, well, a partial return to that older dynamic where money isn't solely the domain of the state.
Decentralized networks playing a bigger role.
Exactly. Which naturally leads to big questions about the future balance between public money issued by central banks and these private forms.
Okay, but a practical concern many listeners might have. Could governments just seize Bitcoin? What does Middle Coop think about confiscation risk?
He seems pretty skeptical that widespread confiscation is feasible, mainly because of how Bitcoin is built.
It's design.
Yeah, it's decentralized. The ownership records, the ledger, are spread across thousands, maybe millions of computers globally. There's no central vault to raid, unlike physical gold.
Oh, okay.
So while maybe specific individuals could be targeted, seizing all of it or even significant chunk seems technically extremely difficult, maybe impossible.
And that leads to this really intriguing idea he floats. The U.S. potentially using Bitcoin and stablecoins strategically, not just allowing them, but leveraging them to keep the dollar strong and maybe even help with the national debt. How would that work?
It's a fascinating concept. The thinking goes something like this. If the U.S. embraces and regulates dollar-pegged stablecoins, these could become the rails for faster, cheaper international trade.
Okay.
If everyone starts using these U.S. dollar stablecoins for global transactions, that actually increases demand for the underlying dollars or maybe the U.S. Treasury bonds backing them.
So it props up the dollar indirectly.
Exactly. It could help maintain the dollar's global role, even in a digital world, and potentially make it easier to finance the national debt if demand for treasuries stays high. And then there's the separate idea of the U.S. government itself maybe holding Bitcoin as a strategic reserve asset, like digital gold, as a hedge.
Wow. Okay, let's pivot slightly to actual gold. It seems to be playing a big, maybe quieter role here, too. Middle Coop notes, demand is up, the price is rising. What's that telling us?
He reads that as a signal of declining trust in traditional unbacked fiat currencies, money like the dollar or euro that isn't tied to gold.
The flight to safety.
Pretty much. When things feel uncertain economically or geopolitically, gold has historically been that go-to safe haven asset, a physical store of value.
And he stresses that countries like China and Russia are accumulating massive amounts of gold, maybe even more than the West holds now. What are the implications there?
Well, it could be a strategic move to diversify away from holding too many U.S. dollars.
Right. Reduce dependency.
Exactly, and build up their own reserves of something tangible. If trust in the dollar system erodes further, having a lot of gold could give them more financial independence, more leverage on the world stage.
Which makes that phrase he quotes, "He who has the gold makes the rules," sound pretty relevant, even now.
It really does. It suggests that despite all the focus on digital finance and geopolitics, physical gold still holds this deep underlying significance in the global power game.
Moving beyond pure finance, Middle Coop also connects these dots to wider geopolitics. He suggests conflicts, like the tragic situation in Gaza, can sometimes be viewed as proxy battles in this larger U.S.-China struggle. That's a very stark view.
It is sobering. His argument is that regional conflicts don't happen in a vacuum. They can become arenas for this wider competition, with major powers backing different sides, which just makes everything more complex and dangerous.
And complicates the moral calculus for other nations.
Right. He raises that dilemma for Western countries: should they automatically align with U.S. foreign policy, or is a more independent stance sometimes needed?
He also flips the script a bit, suggesting the West might be isolating itself even while it accuses Russia of being isolated. How does that work?
His point is that if the West pushes too hard, demands absolute alignment, takes too many unilateral actions, it can actually push other countries away.
Even potential partners.
Even countries that might share some Western values but dislike being told what to do. So you risk creating this counter-coalition of nations looking for alternatives to U.S. dominance, seeking a more multipolar world. It's an ironic potential outcome.
And finally, he really digs into changes happening within the West, particularly Europe, painting a picture that reinforces his downward phase idea. He talks about the wealthy leaving places like the UK or Canada for Dubai, Singapore.
The importing poverty, exporting wealth line.
Yeah. What's driving that migration of wealth?
It's likely a mix of things: higher taxes in some Western countries, maybe more regulation, concerns about social stability, and just the perception of better opportunities elsewhere, especially in dynamic hubs in Asia or the Middle East.
And that outflow obviously isn't great for the economies they leave behind.
No, losing capital and talent is a headwind. He also mentions increasing financial repression in Europe, things like limits on using cash, more scrutiny on money transfers across borders.
Why are governments doing that? And what's the impact on ordinary people?
Officially, it's usually framed as fighting tax evasion, money laundering, terrorism financing, and maybe it helps with that.
Yeah.
But it also chips away at financial freedom, makes normal transactions more cumbersome, and some worry it could stifle economic activity or just push things underground.
Then there's the rise of the digital nomad people working remotely, maybe globally. How does that trend fit into this shifting landscape?
It's another disruptor. These nomads challenge old ideas about work, taxes, national borders. Countries might lose tax revenue if their citizens work from abroad.
Right.
It impacts local housing markets, maybe social cohesion in some places, but it can also bring skills and spending to new areas. It's a complex shift in how societies are structured.
He even brings up recent election results in England as, like, another data point suggesting the old order is fraying. It really does feel like a convergence of factors.
It does. He ties it all together: demographics, housing crises, environmental pressures, rising taxes in Europe as reinforcing this challenging period, this potential downward phase for the West.
Okay, so if we try to boil all this down,
Yeah.
the big takeaway from our deep dive into Middlecoup's perspective is that we're undeniably in a time of huge global change. A real power transition seems to be happening.
A fundamental shift.
Yeah, and it's not abstract. It affects everything from top-level geopolitics and global finance right down to things that could impact your personal finances, your outlook.
And just making sense of these underlying currents beneath the day-to-day news churn is really crucial, isn't it? For navigating what's coming. For countries, sure, but also for individuals.
It truly is. So maybe here's a final thought to leave you with. If we accept this possibility, this world where power, financial, political is becoming more dispersed, where the West's long dominance is being seriously contested, what does that actually mean for your choices?
Your finances, your career path.
Exactly. How you understand the world. We'd really encourage you, listening, to think beyond the obvious headlines about these trends, the less visible shifts we've talked about today. They might be the ones that matter most in the long run.